that all men are created equal.
As a member of Congress, I get to have a lot of really interesting people in the office, experts on what they're talking about.
This is the podcast
for insights into the issues.
China, bioterrorism, Medicare for all, in-depth discussions.
Breaking it down into simple terms. We hold
these truths.
We hold these truths.
With Dan Crenshaw.
The Eagle has landed.
All right, welcome back, everybody. As promised, now we're talking with, we're going to talk about China with Governor Jon Huntsman. We had a fascinating discussion about Russia about 3 minutes ago, and like I said, we're going to cut those cut those into two episodes. So we are back with Jon. Jon, thanks so much for being on the show again.
Dan, it's a great honor to join you. Thanks so much for having me.
So let's move on to China. We had a really fascinating discussion, really got some great insight from you on our relationship with Russia. And but now let's talk about China, because you were the ambassador to China as well as to Russia, as well as to Singapore. So we're just going back through your resume a little bit. You were governor of Utah and currently running for governor of Utah again. So let's talk about China. So you were ambassador to China when?
That would have been 09 through 011.
Okay. So really at the beginning of the Obama administration.
That's right.
And like you've served under multiple presidents. And okay, so China's obviously in the news quite a bit lately. I've recently been told that it might be sanctioned by China because of the legislation that I've put forth to allow Americans to take China to court for COVID-19 related cover-ups. My sense is that it's time for America to wake up to the reality of China. I think we're living in a world where we hoped that China would become a responsible member of the global community. And it seems pretty obvious now that they've never had any intention of doing that. Would you generally agree with that?
I think that's a fair comment. I think it may underplay to some extent the confusion within the bureaucracy in China in terms of where they want to go. Because I don't think it's clear when you look at some of the discussions they have between closed doors, what role they want on the world stage. You have to remember that China, the Middle Kingdom, a country of 1.3 billion people, 15 nation states on its periphery, all of the elements for global power and leadership, they've pretty much been confined to their own neighborhood historically, and they haven't ventured out a whole lot. Admiral Zheng He did somewhat in his day, but by and large, they're a cautious people. And so they find themselves on the world stage for the first time in at least a few centuries. We have to remember that China had the leading economy in the world for many centuries, probably 300 years ago. So here they are, and they don't know how to drive the car. So they're given the keys, they're on the world stage, and what they hate more than anything is to lose face, to fail publicly, because that's disastrous for leadership. It's disastrous, they think, for the people of the country. So I think there are a lot of debates internally about where China should go and what its global role should be. Xi Jinping has been very clear, and I think he's consolidated power to the point where he and his team know exactly where they want to go, and they want global leadership and global dominance.
Yeah, that much is clear. I mean, the Belt and Road Initiative, China 2025, they're very clear about it. They steal our intellectual property like it's their job, and I think they do see it as their job. And they buy up ports throughout the world. Let's see, there's a lot of data on this, but it includes a maritime component, of course, the maritime Silk Road China. It's invested heavily in European ports, buying 51% of a Greek port, Piraeus, and other ones like Haifa and Israel, which was really frustrating for America to see that. I had those conversations with Israelis because this all sort of came out in the news as I was visiting Israel, and we were all, Democrats and Republicans, were like, "What's going on here, guys?" And they didn't really have an explanation. It's almost like it happened beyond the reach of Israeli security forces as well. It's almost like it happened under their noses as well, or at least that's how they talked about it. But are they trying to change the Mediterranean into this sort of sphere of Chinese influence? Or it's not just the Mediterranean, but around the world? I mean, and how does that help them? How do they see that benefiting them?
Well, so we're talking specifically about the Belt Road Initiative. The Chinese would call it the 一带一路, the One Belt, One Road. And it goes all the way back to 2013. I think it was launched in Astana, Kazakhstan, and their aspirations are unbelievably off the chart in terms of what they're spending or what they're planning to spend trillions of dollars, and they're weaving probably 65% of the world's population into their new sort of modern day Silk Road trading routes. And they've got about 40% of the global GDP that's part of this as well. So it envisions, a network of rails, roads, ports, energy infrastructure, primarily connecting China with Eurasia. That's their initial bet. And then with Eurasia and beyond, you got probably 68 countries totally that are part of that 40% of the global GDP. So what do they want? They want influence and leverage. It's a play for dominance in world affairs. Make no mistake about that. And why this is so extraordinary, having watched and been part of relationship building and problem solving with the Chinese for 40 years. The Chinese have never ventured out before. So to see something this bold and this aspirational is something that is altogether unique for the Chinese, which means they're going to stumble, they're going to fall, they're going to fail, they're going to embarrass themselves. And I think you're going to see at some point some real backlash, anti-Chinese reaction, which we're already seeing in places like Pakistan, Malaysia, and Sri Lanka. And, to say nothing of the trouble that they're likely to have in Central Asia when they blaze their trail through Russia's traditional domain. So they want influence and leverage. They want opportunities for Chinese firms, but they also want to be able to project their military capability. So there's a military and there's an intelligence component as well. I have to say the one thing they really admire about the United States, they admire a lot about the United States, but when it comes to our military capabilities, we're able to, through heavy lift capabilities, basically deploy anywhere in the world within a number of hours. Mm-hmm. We're the only country in the world really that can do that. They very much want to be in a position where they can deploy to protect now their economic interests, the supply lines coming from Africa and Latin America that fuel their economy. They didn't have to worry about those before, but today they do because their economy has become so large. So they want outposts like they've got in Djibouti right now in the Horn of Africa, where they can deploy, they can protect their sea lanes, they can protect their flow of raw materials to keep the mothership going. And this is altogether new. And so the part that I find most disheartening and potentially dangerous about this is the negotiating of military agreements in many of the strategic places where they are moving with the Belt Road Initiative. And that's something that we're going to have to counter.
Yeah, I think we do. And I wonder if this theory would hold correct. Maybe it's an optimistic theory that, like you said, there's already some rejection of this sort of new Chinese imperialism, just like there's always been rejection of imperialism. There's a natural human need to live free and self-govern. And so I wonder if they don't realize that, because their cultural thinking is so different than Western civilization. They really are a collectivist society, and so they may not understand the psychology of that backlash. But I think it will happen because for all the weird accusations that America has ever been imperialist, it's fundamentally not true. Do we have a lot of influence everywhere? Yes, but it's always been done through partnerships. It's been done through diplomacy and economic partnerships, and I think that while you may not gain short-term advantage by doing that, or at least to the extent that we would like, there's a long-term advantage because there's a trust that is endowed in those relationships, and I think that's ultimately more sustainable than what the Chinese are doing, which is largely forced. It's these loan programs that are predatory in nature. It's really being forced on developing countries in some ways, and I think eventually they wake up to that and realize that they're just being, in Africa especially, they're just being, pilloried for their resources. So I wonder if it's sustainable, and if the Chinese just spend a ton of money and go into a ton of debt for something that's ultimately not all that beneficial, or should we be more worried about it than that?
Yeah, and everything you've said, Dan, is absolutely true. They're venturing out for the first time. Let's just remember that. And with it will come a lot of headaches and a lot of misery for them. But the reason they're venturing out, I mean, they're not venturing out just because they want to. They're venturing out because they have to. They're venturing out because they have critical supply lines of raw materials and feedstocks that keep the Middle Kingdom going. They know that if their economy falters, there's chaos and there's the end of China, basically. The one thing they learned in the spring of 1989, before the Tiananmen Square massacre, was, those kids gathered in Tiananmen Square to mourn the death of beloved party secretary Hu Yaobang, who was a real reformer. Mm-hmm. But many others gathered, including taxi drivers, truck drivers, and ordinary citizens, because inflation was high. And food supplies were low, and unemployment was off the charts. So they look at the economic indicators every day, and they know darn well that if the economic indicators get beyond a certain level, it creates real instability in the city centers. So their goal, number one, is domestic stability. How do you maintain domestic stability? You maintain domestic stability by keeping your foot on the economic gas pedal. How do you do that without having all these kinds of raw material relationships with Africa and the Middle East and Latin America to fuel your economy? You can't do it any other way. So by design, they basically have had to venture out to secure these supply lines. And that's exactly what they're doing, and it's why the deployment of military is something that they're clearly keen on doing, because for them it's a matter of life and death, and it all gets right down to whether or not they can sustain their economic growth.
So U.S.-China relations, I think, are at a low point. There's and for good reason. I know we have good evidence that the Chinese acted very poorly on this COVID-19 pandemic and deliberately hid the virus, deliberately delivered misinformation about it, allowed international travel, but actually restricted domestic travel because they knew what was going on. It's we could pontificate about their intentions all day long, and whether that was really just to save face or whether it was truly malevolent, I don't know. I just know they did it. And so relations are at an all-time low, and they were already kind of going low as and I think Trump really did this, really woke America up to this unfair relationship that we've had with China, where they steal our intellectual property. They don't allow investment in their country, but they expect to invest and take over our businesses and then move that manufacturing to their country. This has frustrated a lot of Americans for a very long time. Trump tapped into that in a very big way. The question is always, okay, what do we do about it? It's not as simple as just, and we can implement tariffs and we can have better trade negotiations. And obviously we're on track to do that before COVID-19 hit. But the president's in a difficult situation now. He's not sure whether that trade deal or the next phase of trade deals is really appropriate given what the Chinese have done with COVID-19. So what advice would you give the president on this, and what how do we move forward with the Chinese and protect American interests?
Well, let's remember that dealing with China will be our most significant national security challenge for the rest of the 21st century. China isn't going anywhere, and neither is the United States. And what China has that Russia doesn't have are elements of power that can sustain its aspirations. So they have access to the key markets, they have raw materials, they have 1.3 billion people, they have manufacturing and innovative capacity, they have good research universities, they have a pretty good bank account for the most part, they have a stable system. I mean, call the Chinese Communist Party what you will, the 80 million members of the party in thousands of different outposts around the country. And it really is much less a Marxist-Leninist organization than it is more of an organizing locust for people who want to advance their careers. Mm-hmm. But it is a stable organization for the most part. And to my mind, it will be stable so long as the economy is strong. And that's why Xi Jinping went through the whole anti-corruption campaign for the last 5 years. He saw that the party was rotting from within because of the self-dealing, because of the corruption, because of the high living of the party mandarins and the party elite. And he went about basically, exiling hundreds of senior cadre and thousands of others, both in the People's Liberation Army and within the party itself. so that he could prove to the people of China that he had restored integrity to the party. I don't think people realize how close the party was to losing itself, which would have completely caused the country to implode. And Xi Jinping rose, almost about 8 years ago. And his number one task was to restore integrity and strength to the party. And so that has been his primary goal. And that he's, so far as I can tell, he's been able to do. But you have to look at what our levers of power are. We have enormous strengths that we sometimes underutilize. Our ability to innovate, to create, to deploy our military, to keep a strong Seventh Fleet, making sure that freedom of navigation operations are ongoing, that the sea lanes in the South China Sea and beyond are open for the free flow of trade and commerce, that we very strategically build relationships on China's periphery with countries like India and Mongolia, with Korea, Japan, and some in Southeast Asia. Vietnam is a good example of a more recent periphery country with whom we've developed a really good relationship.
Yeah.
So these provide us the ability to contain. The Chinese hate that word, by the way, but that's what it does.
Yeah, they do.
It allows us to have eyes and ears in terms of where China is, and it allows us to basically hedge in terms of checking China's power. And these are things that we should be doing and doing to the best of our ability.
Well, yeah, that's absolutely right. And I mean, that was what the shift to the Pacific was supposed to do. The pivot, sorry. It was the pivot to the Pacific, because alliteration makes for a better phraseology. And so, but we never, I don't know that we really ever did anything with the pivot to the Pacific. Would you agree or disagree with that? I mean, I was in the Navy and I just don't remember a lot changing when we did that, but I can obviously see the logic in it, because what you're really saying is relationships are a force multiplier, and that's really important in international relations. You want those force multipliers. You want to be able to train the Vietnamese to do things that we don't really want to do. That's fundamentally what special operations is. When we're not at war, we're not going after high value targets. We're in these countries constantly doing exercises with our counterparts because we want them to do it. We want them to be strong and be our allies so that we don't have to.
So here's what the pivot has, and it's not just a result of the pivot. It's a result of managing the Asia Pacific region based on our national security and economic interests. I think the most important plays that have been made are improving some of our trade ties with relationships that were completely imbalanced. With Korea, for example, is a good one. Japan, our relationship has been out of kilter for a long time, and the Chinese relationship economically has been a disaster in terms of what they're getting and how we have been ripped off and fleeced through intellectual property theft. I chaired the Intellectual Property Theft Commission a few years ago, and did it with my co-chair, Admiral Denny Blair, who used to be the Director of National Intelligence. And we spent a year really drilling down on who is responsible for intellectual theft. How are they getting it? What is it costing the United States? And what can we do about it? And at the end of the report, 70% of the theft was pretty much from the Chinese. And it was from Chinese government-sponsored organizations, but it was also from Chinese universities and entrepreneurs and triads and gangs and stuff. We presented that to Congress. We presented it to the last administration. And it was interesting. The only people who looked at this and said, this is exactly what we've been looking for, was the incoming Trump administration. And so we basically handed over our blueprint, our roadmap, on how to respond to intellectual property theft. And that's pretty much what the president has done in return, some really hard-hitting measures, because the Chinese won't respond to anything unless there's countervailing pressure for the most part.
What else do we need to do on that front? I mean, because it's still a problem, obviously. And like you said, Trump has taken China more seriously than probably any administration in living memory. I do see some bipartisan. I mean, we have these conversations in the Homeland Security Committee. I do see bipartisan concern about what the Chinese are doing with intellectual property theft. So what else can Congress do that we haven't done already? Well, honestly, Congress hasn't done much. Let's be honest. I think the administration has. But what else should we be doing?
Well, Congress has an ability to speak with a unified voice. So when Congress stands up,
do we though?
No. But listen, if China or listen, if COVID-19 can't become a national interest for the United States around which Republicans and Democrats can unite, something fundamentally is wrong. I mean, here we have very clear-cut national interest in both cases, where the problem when you just have the Republicans take up one set of issues and the Democrats, the Chinese know how our system works. They know how to divide and conquer, and they'll never take anything like that seriously. What they fear is a united front on the part of the United States when we have all of our actors together really focusing on an outcome. So let's just imagine that outcome is, running tariffs up or blocking China from taking their companies public on the New York Stock Exchange, or maybe adding to CFIUS. Maybe you add intellectual property theft to CFIUS. If your company isn't in any way tied to intellectual property theft, that too is going to be reviewed along with other national security concerns. Little steps like this really go a long way in gumming up the works in terms of China's economic expansion, much of which they want to see take place here in the United States.
I think there's some hope for that. It depends on the issue. So what I've noticed is that Democrats are very much against any narrative at all that China is to blame. Why? Because they want to blame Trump for COVID-19, and it's pure partisan politics, and I'm disgusted by it, but that's the reality that I'm living in right now. Now, that being said, it seems that Democrat colleagues are very much willing to talk about options on, bringing the supply chains home. Well, why are we manufacturing all our PPE in China? Why are we manufacturing all of our drugs in China? That seems to be very bipartisan and seems to be some good space to move forward on that. I think the question is more technical at this point. Okay, it's easy to say that. Bring the supply chains home. It's a little harder to do. Do you have, and you've been a deputy U.S. trade representative. You probably know a little bit about this subject too. What would you say to our policymakers?
It's hard to do, Dan, because those decisions are made in the boardrooms of corporations, and having sat on the board of boards of companies like Ford Motor Company and Caterpillar, both of whom are huge global players, what we're going to see in the aftermath of COVID-19, I have no question about it, will be boards of companies that have doubled and tripled down in the China market over the last 20 and 30 years. You're going to see, because of a lack of trust in how China handled this whole thing and their need to want to diversify out of the China market, you're going to see boards, without the United States government prompting them, making decisions to disrupt supply chains to make sure they're not too top heavy in one particular market. And you're going to see them basically diversified. And I think some of that is going to come back to the United States, as it should. And that's where, countries, some will benefit. India may pick up a little, Vietnam might pick up a little bit, but the United States should pick up a whole lot. And you've got states like Texas and Utah that are very, very competitive states by virtue of tax code, by virtue of the regulatory regime. These are states that should really be able to pick up in terms of manufacturing, research and development, and other kinds of investments coming out of China. So I actually see this for the U.S. economy as being a very, very promising time over the next couple of years, because this is inevitable. That this is going to happen, and it's the price that China will be paying for basically the most serious attack on the United States in our history.
Yeah, but we still want to incentivize it to an extent, because I think you're right. I think a lot of boards, like you're saying, are going to be doing it on their own. It would so then what's the right amount of intervention from government? Do we offer tax credits? I think Japan, I believe, said that's what they're doing. They're offering massive tax credits to anybody who leaves China and brings it back to Japan. But the counter argument to that is you can never out tax credit the Chinese. You can never out subsidize the Chinese. So that's a small part of it, but it can't possibly be the whole part of it. You have to look at who's investing and where investors want their manufacturing to take place, just based on the cost. You have to, do you even go further than that and say, well, hey, listen, a percentage of this has to be manufactured in the United States? That's a bit of a blunt tool to use. So, what is the best way to do it?
I think the heavy-handed mandates probably are not the best thing. I just don't see that as a good and useful role for government. Uh, States can also play a role. Let's not forget that states, manage their own economic framework, and they're able to create their own set of incentives if that's what they want to do. But capital is a coward, and capital always flees wherever it perceives there to be risk in the marketplace, and it finds a safe haven eventually. I don't think safe havens are always created by, incentive programs. I think they're created by the natural state of the marketplace, and we have a really good marketplace in the United States. So that's why I'm a big believer and confident in the idea that this capital is going to flow out, because there's more risk now in the China market. They're not going to be able to solve that anytime soon,
Right.
and the diversification process is going to occur.
So maybe the role of policymakers is to make sure that there is more risk in the China market. For instance, saying we are going to sanction state-owned companies. We are going to make it harder for them to invest, and so that in and of itself makes it more risky to invest in China at all.
There you go. So your joint venture partners in China, if they're sanctioned state-owned enterprises, as most of them are, if they've been involved in intellectual property theft, if they're in any way tied to the buildup of China's military, if they're in any way involved in malign activities from an intelligence standpoint, there are any number of things you can look at and say that company should be sanctioned. I mean, right now, in the case of Russia, which we talked about just a little while ago, we've got probably 900 companies, organizations, and individuals sanctioned for all the reasons that we've just discussed.
Yeah.
So, China would hate to fall into that same category, but that's kind of where we're going. And it then means that a lot of your natural joint venture partner options are off the table, which means you don't have a lot left to work with, which means you're going to find new markets.
We're just solving the world's problems here on the Hold These Truths podcast. It's just what we do. So the last subject I want to hit is Taiwan. This is a tricky one. What is the U.S. interest in Taiwan? Can you give us the background on it for people who aren't experts on China, the one China policy, Taiwan, what it means, all of that, and how should we look to Taiwan in the future? What should our relationship with them be?
Well, Taiwan is a very, very good example of a modern day democracy. And complete with civil society and free elections. So I've lived there twice in my life. I've gone out and attended political rallies all the way back to when the country was under martial law, when Chiang Kai-shek's son ran the place, and the transformation that has occurred there over the last 40 years has been nothing short of astonishing. It really is a great success story in civil society, the principles of democracy. All coming to fruition and life. So how did it all happen? In short, the civil war that occurred in China after the creation of the Communist Party under Mao Zedong in the early 1920s ran head on in terms of their desire to want to lead the country head on against Chiang Kai-shek, who was running sort of the Republican Party. They were corrupt, there's no doubt about that, so you had problems on both sides. But it ultimately resulted after the end of World War II in an extended civil war, which ended with Mao defeating Chiang Kai-shek. Chiang being, of course, our ally, the U.S. America's ally during World War II against the Japanese, and Mao's victory basically forced Chiang and a couple million of his followers out of mainland China over to the island of Taiwan, which until just a few years before had been under Japanese occupation. So the Japanese occupied it going all the way back to 1895 and continued to occupy it until the end of World War II, 1945. Chiang took his provisional government, which was in Nanjing before he had to flee, and he set it up in Taiwan, thereby creating in 1949 the Republic of China, ROC. And of course, they were an ally of ours. Meanwhile, Mao set up the People's Republic of China in Beijing under a communist form of government. We had diplomatic relations with quote unquote China. The problem was sort of in definition, it was with Taiwan and Chiang's government, not with mainland China. And we continued that state of affairs until about 1972, when Richard Nixon sat down with Zhou Enlai, then the premier of China, and Chairman Mao, and basically came up with a formula. And of course, Taiwan was right at the center of the formula. How do you deal with Taiwan? Because right now, you Americans, Taiwan is China to you, yet we are the real China. Mm-hmm. And they came up with a formulation, basically, of a one China policy. We're only going to recognize one China, we being the United States. You both can claim that you're China, and we'll just kind of leave it ambiguous from there.
Yeah.
And it was a few years later, in 1979, that we formally moved our U.S. ambassador and embassy from Taiwan to mainland China.
And Americans have been confused ever since.
Right.
I mean, that's the reality.
Yeah. No, that's exactly right. So the years after 1979 in Taiwan, and of course the Taiwanese were very, very angry. I moved to Taiwan in 1979, late 1979. So I was there right in the aftermath of the anti-Americanism, and believe me, I felt it very, very deeply.
Yeah, they felt betrayed.
Absolutely, absolutely. So Chiang Kai-shek's son took over Jiang Jingguo, and he ran it until they actually had their first democratic election in 1987. I was also living in Taiwan when they had that first democratic election in 1987, and out of it was elected Lee Deng-hui, who was a native Taiwanese-born leader, no ties to the mainland, educated in Japan for the most part. His family had been raised under Japanese occupation, so he spoke Japanese, read Japanese newspapers in the morning. So that was their first experiment, the late 1980s, with democracy. So they dropped martial law. They lifted the ban on opposition political parties. They freed up the press. They opened civil society. And since the late 1980s, Taiwan has been an example of a blossoming society. It's really quite a place, and they've really cleaned it up for the most part compared to what it was when I lived there in the late 1970s. So here we have, but part of the arrangement in recognizing back in the 70s, recognizing the communist government in China was to provide a protective guarantee, a security guarantee for Taiwan. So we consider, although it's not always openly stated, we have security arrangements with a half dozen countries throughout the Asia Pacific region. One of them really is Taiwan, which is to say that we're responsible for their defense. And there's always been a lot of discussion about how that would actually play out if their territory were ever threatened. Yeah,
and that we talked about this on the last podcast, which was really the same conversation. But what would be the American will to actually defend Taiwan? And it's certainly an interesting question. So how much influence does the Chinese government have over Taiwan? And this and just to be clear, from you, as you explained the very detailed history, which you just apparently know off the top of your head, which is very impressive. They both consider themselves to be China. The American, so the way Nixon dealt with that and the way American policy dealt with that was we'll call you both China. It's ambiguity, which is maybe, I wonder if over time has that created more problems than solutions. So how much influence does the Chinese government have over Taiwan, if any? Or are they just completely separate entities? How does this really work in practice?
Well, so the Chinese are very active in Taiwan from just an intelligence gathering standpoint, and the Taiwanese are very active in China. They've got deep roots there too. So they both keep an eye on each other. So the Chinese developed and implemented a policy of economic engagement with Taiwan back in the 1990s after a couple of agreements were struck between both of them. I remember one was struck in Singapore. I was living there at the time, running the embassy. And they both basically said, okay, we've been in a state of civil war. Let's now start exchanging things just on a very preliminary basis. So they had their first direct flight that went from Taipei. I can't remember where it went, but it may have been Hangzhou or Fujian. And then what followed that was a very aggressive and substantial ramp up of trade and investment, mostly by China in Taiwan. So China's bet at the time was, we can so sink them with our economic might and the goodwill that we're going to generate through helping to build and stabilize their economy, which in the case of Taiwan wasn't terribly stable at the time. And that has been their overriding policy for the most part. So Taiwan companies have been built up. Their economy has done well. You know, people should know that Taiwan's probably our 10th or 12th largest trading partner, ours, the United States is. And they're probably China's largest trading partner when you look at the numbers today, or at least their largest investment partner. So what has happened in return is a lot of Taiwanese investment, as many have become wealthy in Taiwan and major corporations have been built up. So they've invested a lot now in China. So you've got this interlocking kind of interdependent economic relationship now between China and Taiwan. So the biggest fear that the Chinese have, if they were to go too heavy-handed on the Taiwanese, is it would sort of kill the golden goose. This is kind of the argument with Hong Kong, too. You know, it's been such a provider of cash and capital and access to major markets of the world. You know, how far do they actually want to take that?
Right. So our, in a sense, our security agreement with Taiwan banks on this assumption that the Chinese would find it way too costly to actually take action against Taiwan in the first place. Well, let me ask the question in another way, which is, okay, if you're the Chinese government, what do you call Taiwan? Do you call it an extension of China that's being annoying right now and you know, going against your rule? And if you're Taiwanese, what do you call yourself? Do you call yourself China, or do you call yourself a different country named Taiwan?
This is all really interesting, because when Taiwan is involved in any international organization that the Chinese control, and that's pretty much all of them, you know, Taiwan can never enter under the Republic of China designation. So it enters under sometimes China Taipei, or some sort of play on, you know, the capital name, names of surrounding islands. Sometimes they call themselves by the custom territory that they're designated by in other organizations. But what is happening, Dan, and this is the most interesting part, is where Taiwan has come over the last 10 plus years and where it's likely headed, because this is where it gets really dicey. So the one red line that the Chinese have with Taiwan is ultimate independence. If ever they were to have a plebiscite or a vote that would take them toward independent status, the Chinese have said that they would invade. They would blockade and they would invade. Well, you look at elections most recently, and you now have the country that's run by the DPP, the Minjindang, the Green Party, if you will, run by a woman named Tsai Ing-wen, who I've been over to meet with a couple of times. I've known her for a while. And they were outlawed. They were banned in the early days of martial law in Taiwan because they had an independence platform. So as part of their party platform, their ultimate goal was to take Taiwan toward independence. They have since taken that out of their party platform just to, you know, quiet down a lot of the criticism and to make them more of a mainstream party. And so when you look at the breakdown of the population in Taiwan, a country of maybe about 25 million people, 75+% are native-born Taiwanese. Mm-hmm. And there's a remainder that come from the families that Chiang Kai-shek brought over in the late 1940s. So that is to say that there's been almost an inexorable move toward Taiwanization, both in terms of politics and culture. So when I last sat down with President Tsai Ing-wen, and this was before I think I went to Russia, she referred, so we were speaking Chinese, I'm a Chinese speaker, and she referred to herself as woman Taiwanren, we Taiwanese people. Now, when I heard that, I about fell out of my chair, because that never would have been uttered by any previous president. Previous presidents always would say, woman Zhongguoren, we Chinese people. And as I met with members of the Legislative Yuan, which is her legislature, and met with other leaders in civil society, it was clear to me, and I've kept sort of close tabs on Taiwan for a lot of years now, how quickly they have moved toward Taiwanization. Well, I don't know how much farther you can go without the people saying, okay, we would rather be the Republic of Taiwan as opposed to the Republic of China, and playing this game of semantics. We'd like to be in the Olympics. We'd like to be in the United Nations, in the World Bank, on and on and on. So this is going to become a very scratchy kind of conversation, and it really irritates the mainland because they see where Tsai Ing-wen and the DPP party has taken the conversation, and it concerns them greatly, and they really don't know what to do.
And we don't either. So what should we do? I mean, what's the right attitude for America to take on this? Do we continue in ambiguity? Do we continue to support more of a Taiwan nationalism, which is sort of what I'm more inclined to do? In small ways. For instance, we've looked at allowing during RIMPAC exercises, allowing the Taiwanese Navy to wear their actual Taiwanese patches. Which is something that they usually don't do. And so there's this weird middle ground that we can start to, and as we rebalance our relationship with China, should Taiwan be a part of that, and the way we recognize Taiwan be a part of that?
Well, listen, the Chinese are masters at playing the long game. They do that better than anybody in the world. We're masters at the short game. We don't do the long game, and we're pretty much the best in the world playing the short game. And we have to remember that the Chinese are going to solve this over the longer term. And what the Chinese mainland wants is, as they say in Chinese, 结合起来. They want a reunification of what they consider to be a lost province. It was lost, of course, when the Japanese invaded back in 1895. So we never really had a chance to talk about, so what are China's core interests? What really drives their foreign policy?
Yeah.
And when you look at their core interests, one of them is state sovereignty, and another one is territorial integrity. So their whole game over the last 25 years, as you have seen, is to regain the lost territories. They want the mothership, the Middle Kingdom, to be whole once again. So what have we seen? We've seen Hong Kong revert back, 1997, after the Opium Wars of the 1840s, basically, when the Brits were given Hong Kong. That finally came to an end. So the Chinese got Hong Kong in 97. They got Macau in 99. They hold Xinjiang. They've pretty much given up on Outer Mongolia, which is now the Mongolian People's Republic. And Tibet, of course, is in their bailiwick right now. Where they have not been totally successful in recovering their territories, quote unquote, is Taiwan and the South China Sea bathtub, and some of the islands that are still in dispute between China and Japan, namely the Senkaku Islands, that as the Chinese will call them, the Diaoyu Islands. And so these are their priorities right now. They will not be a complete country until they get Taiwan back and until they basically dominate the South China Sea. So it's going to be a long game. They have to take into consideration the economic destruction that would be created if they were to go kinetic against Taiwan. And going back to our original conversation early in this podcast, the one thing that the Chinese leadership fears most is instability within their country. And instability is always driven, well, pretty much two things. One, an underperforming economy, and number two is corruption among the party elite run rapid.
Yeah, and understanding their core interest is important because from an outsider perspective, it doesn't make any sense that you would actually go to war into what? To control what exactly? It's just not clear to us from the outside. I think you have to live inside the minds of the Chinese and understand their history to understand why they would want Taiwan to be part of mainland China. Because it seems to me that you wouldn't want to deal with a population that overwhelmingly wants to be independent. And again, this is a very American take on it because you can accuse us of being imperialist all you want. It's just never been true. What has been true over time is that we've given up territory. We might be involved somewhere, but we quickly give it up. We don't stay there. It's never been an American interest to have any kind of imperialistic endeavors. And so it's hard for us to understand why, if a population is overwhelmingly becoming independent, why you wouldn't allow that to happen and actually take military action to prevent it. Seems very counterproductive. And so I guess it's a policymaker, or it's a question for policymakers. Do we really believe the Chinese threats?
Well, I think we have to. You have to, Dan. You have to live in China to really understand the deep sentiment among the Chinese people as it relates to Taiwan. A lost territory are comrades who need to be reunited. Some of them are broken up family members who have since kind of been reunited. But So when they have talks together, the Taiwanese and the Chinese, which is done very infrequently, the Chinese always refer to them as, our fellow comrades, our fellow countrymen, is how they sort of patronizingly refer to them. So serving as U.S. ambassador when the United States sells arms to Taiwan, as I experienced, you feel the full brunt of the Taiwan issue. You were called in at 2 a.m. You were dressed down. You were put on ice for months. Nobody will see you. You're written up in all of the party propaganda sheets as, being the great devil. This is an issue that is red hot. And a lot of it is, again, the difference between the United States and China in the sense the Chinese are traditionalists. I mean, they have one continuous history going back 5,000 years. Mm-hmm. And they say, what is the Middle Kingdom? And they pull out the maps from the Qing dynasty when it ended in 1911, when Sun Yat-sen stood up the Republic of China. It didn't last very long, but the period of empire came to an end in 1911, at least the imperial court. So when you pull out the maps as they do from 1911, it shows China, the Middle Kingdom. And all of these sort of peripheral elements that we have described are all part of China. And it has become a core interest of theirs, particularly in recent times, because they didn't have the clout or the power or the diplomatic squad, until 10 or 15 years ago to do anything about it. So they didn't even bother with it. But this has always been an absolute central core interest to them when they had the power, when they had the standing to recover their lost territories. So that's where Taiwan factors so prominently, and it's where the South China Sea, again, factors so prominently.
Okay, so last question on this: if you poll Taiwanese and you ask them a simple question about independence versus being reunited with China, what will they say?
I think that's changed a lot. When China was more of a benevolent trading partner, and when they were reuniting families, and we go back to the 90s now, and into the early 2000s. I think there was a more benign attitude about ultimately figuring it out, coming up with, a one country, two systems kind of arrangement, coming up with a confederation kind of arrangement. Mm-hmm. And then came the change in Taiwan politics and the movement on the part of the Democratic Progressive Party, the DPP, and then Hong Kong. So make no mistake about it, Dan. I mean, the people of Taiwan are taking lessons from what's happened in Hong Kong the last little while. And that is China coming in, with an agreement that was struck between Margaret Thatcher and Deng Xiaoping back in, I think, summer of 1987, mm-hmm. basically holding Hong Kong harmless, which has hardly been the case. And as the Taiwanese have seen that play out, particularly with, sort of the umbrella uprisings of the recent year or two, they say, no, we're not going there. No, we're not going to make that mistake. And I think that totally has transformed the thinking of a lot of people in Taiwan. And I think you probably have a shift that has taken place from, okay, maybe it's not such a bad idea. Maybe we, since we're concerned about economics first and politics second, we can come up with some sort of arrangement with the Chinese. But as democratic institutions have taken hold and as they have strengthened in Taiwan, I think increasingly that is not the sentiment of most people.
Interesting. So it's conflicted. I mean, it's still just like as you would imagine.
It's conflicted, but I think it's the younger generation that has no history, no participation, no recollection of the Chinese Civil War.
Yeah,
they just want to live their lives and do so in a recognized, legitimate nation state, which Taiwan is not. They have much different attitudes.
Yeah, they're more likely to say independence is where we should be going.
That's my sense.
Yeah. Fascinating. John, we'll end it there. Thank you so much for being on the show. We've took up almost 2 hours of your time. So, really appreciate it. It's been really great. And I think people will really enjoy this. And especially if they enjoy it, I don't know why you haven't given the podcast 5 stars yet. So, just.
Well, Dan, it's been a great pleasure. And so long as this podcast outdoes my brother's podcast, I'll be a happy man.
Great. Good. Yeah. So yeah. I didn't tell everybody about that. Just so you know what we're talking about. Remember Peter Huntsman was on the podcast before. Did really, really well. We're going to see if this podcast actually beats his brother, and then they can fight that out behind closed doors. So, hey, John, thank you.